Hello, I'm Jan English Lewick. This YouTube video series profiles workplace anthropologists whose work directly influence their own workplace processes. The video series is part of a workshop in the Business Anthropology Matters initiative. As people increasingly spend their waking hours at workplaces, anthropologists need to understand those experiences. The practitioners profiled here have used anthropological skills to access, document, analyze, and relate the lives of workers and the businesses that employ them. Organizations employ anthropologists to understand a variety of worker-related issues within organizations, ranging from design to strategy. These interviews explore the practical, theoretical, and ethical issues that must be resolved to do workplace anthropology.
My graduate school work had always focused on issues of work. I had done a study for my master's thesis on janitors, and my PhD work was on migrant farm workers and farm workers who had opted out of the migrant stream. I also, while I was doing my PhD field work, was involved with Catholic sisters to try to understand their work lives, as well as Catholic priests. In my last year of graduate school at the University of Texas at Austin, a friend of mine came back from the American Sociological Association meetings, and she said that she had met this gentleman from General Motors who was interested in hiring an anthropologist. And I responded by saying, well, then why didn't he go to the AAA meetings? This would have been back in '83. And she said he did, and he didn't find anyone. So that, first of all, is an indicator of the time, that there was very little interest then in the kinds of job opportunities, or I should say job requirements, where anthropological skills might have been useful. So I responded again to her and said, well, I'm really not interested in becoming somebody who works at General Motors. I'm going to be a professor. And she said, well, don't be silly. This would be a great opportunity for you, and if nothing more than to help you prepare for academic interviews. So I took to heart what she said, and I sent off a note to this man, and he responded immediately and asked if I would send him other kinds of material. So he wanted to see a CV and so on. And so I sent that, and the next thing I know, he's asking for writing samples. And then he came back another time and wanted letters of recommendation. And I was thinking to myself at the time, wow, this is crazy. I'm really getting a lot of interest in this guy. And if I recall correctly, that fall on the job market, there would be probably 300 to 400 people applying for a single academic job. I then went home at Christmas time, and I was spending Christmas with my parents, and 2 days after Christmas, this man calls me, and I was stunned. And all I could say was, how did you get this number? And he said, oh, I just called the anthropology department, and they gave it to me. So anyway, he said, we'd like you to come out to General Motors and to give a seminar. And I said, fine, sure, I'll be happy to do that. And he said, okay, so here's how it's going to go. You're going to prepare a seminar, and it will consist of 4 parts. The first part, you talk a little bit about your background, where you grew up and so on. Next, you talk about, the kinds of research projects that you've been involved with in graduate school. Third, you tell us something about your dissertation research. And fourth, you tell us why General Motors research labs should hire an anthropologist. And you do it in 20 minutes. And I thought, okay, then this is a very different kind of seminar than what I was anticipating. But again, I thought, well, this is pretty good. And I lived while I was at Texas in the graduate dorms, at least before I did my field work. And so I had friends from many different disciplines, included in which were MBA students. And so I had one of my MBA friends take a look at these 20 minutes worth of remarks that I would make, and he helped me to get rid of all the jargon and make it understandable to a general audience, which was a good thing because back in those days and even still today, there's a tendency to use language that you hear other anthropologists using, and you don't realize necessarily that regular people don't understand what the meaning behind key phrases and terms are. So that was very helpful, and I then ended up going to GM, to the research labs, and doing a seminar for them and meeting colleagues and so on. And by the end of that interview day, I knew I wanted to work there. And that's where I spent the next 23 and a half years working at GM Research, and always working on projects that where my anthropological skills were useful. They were pretty much my ideas that were being investigated. So in other words, I did work with some other people, but even in those cases, I was the lead. So it was an opportunity to really explore how anthropology could be used to understand a large, at the time, international and now global company, and how what findings could be considered useful and actionable in terms of recommendations for senior leaders. Well, in 2008, things were getting really bad in automotive and in many other industries, and there were already hints that there would be layoffs, and people were retiring early, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was told by my boss that he just wasn't sure what the future would hold, but that he thought that I would have a very good chance outside of academia. And I listened to what he said, but I really, I had so much going on at GM at the time, so many different projects, that I didn't necessarily take his words totally to heart. I mean, my goal was to try to finish up projects, and then it became clear that many of us were going to lose our jobs. And as it turned out, in April of 2009, and GM went through the bankruptcy, I think, in June and July, very quickly. But in April, all of us who were social scientists, behavioral scientists, and computer scientists lost our job the same day. And it was just devastating. So you can imagine, perhaps, if you've interviewed people who have lost their jobs, it can be a very difficult experience from the point of view of your identity, from the point of view of what do you do now, this kind of thing. But I recovered, I think, relatively quickly, because I had a physician contact me who was interested in having me work with his startup, which was to try to help make doctors' offices much more process friendly and I would say efficient. And he felt like he needed an anthropologist. And so I ended up working with him and his colleague and we brought in a whole bunch of other people for over a year. And we were successful in getting Sanofi, which is the French pharmaceutical company to fund our work. And so that got me started in a different direction from automotive, and I'm still very much interested in medical kinds of issues, particularly with respect to patient experience and how staff try to incorporate patient experience and patient safety and everything else they have to think about into their work lives so that patients have as reasonably good as experience as possible. So that was pretty much the transition on the work front. But at the same time that all of that was going on with this physician, I got a book contract. And I was going to write this book with two of my colleagues, Bob Trotter and Tracy Nearworth, whether or not I stayed at GM, because the project involved a study that we began in 2002, and we felt that it was really, really important to write that up. So we did write it. We wrote this book in 4 months, and it came out in 2010. In 2012, it won the Texter Prize, and it has been and it's called Transforming Culture, and it still is, I think, a very useful text for anyone who is interested in how change can be possible within an organization. Most of the work that is done on organizational change is done by people that come out of more of a psychological tradition, I would say. Many of them are business scholars, of course, but their perspective is very different from a cultural perspective, where you're really focused on the group, and it's not so much about changing individual behavior as it is about getting the group to work in concert towards common goals and a belief that everyone matters. So at any rate, that's kind of how the transition worked for me. Oh, well, for me, that's been just simple. I mean, I have always been very interested in NAPA, the National Association for the Practice of Anthropology. When I joined the AAA back in, I think it was 85 or so, 86, no, 85 maybe, it was the section where I felt the most welcome, and I suppose it was because a number of people were in practice careers, but then there were others who had a strong interest in practice or were just exploring what this thing called practice was. And so I continue to have a very strong relationship with NAPA. As a matter of fact, just this week, I reviewed and edited the new NAPA Statement on Ethics, and I reviewed and edited the sort of rationale for the mentoring strategy. So I'm still very active with NAPA, and in addition to that, I just completed in November a 3-year term on the AAA Executive Board. I filled the practitioner seat, or practitioner professional seat, and ended up doing 2 very interesting projects while I was on the executive board, one of which was on mentoring and, which sections of the AAA and the AAA as a whole were engaged in some form of mentoring formally. And then I also was the lead person, along with Carrie Brondo, on helping the AAA reorganize the 8 programmatic committees, which now have been merged into a single committee called MPAC. The primary way I do that is through my contacts with various anthropologists who are often in this middle ground of scholar practitioner. Many of them have some kind of university appointment and teach on occasion, and then have a consulting role to play outside of a university setting, and then with other practitioners who are full-time in the field, if you will, doing consulting work or working inside organizations. So that's one way. A second way is that I'm very active at the AAA meetings and also at SFAA, and have organized a whole bunch of, as many people do, a whole bunch of panels and sessions over the years. And many of those have led to publications. For example, Marianne McCabe and I just finished a book which is going into what do you call the production phase, September 18th. And that one is called Cultural Change from a Business Anthropology Perspective. And it's an edited volume, and we got a whole bunch of people to write chapters in that book. So that's an alternate way of kind of trying to stay abreast of what's going on. And then I think the third way is I have this senior editorial position on the Journal of Business Anthropology. This is the journal that was started in out of Copenhagen by Brian Morin. And Brian was the editor for 5 years and has since retired and turned over the reins to Greg Urban, who's at Penn. And so there are a few of us that are working closely with Greg to make sure that we have, the issues kind of laid out. One of them is Tim Malafide, and I'm another one. I don't know if he's got anybody else. I think we're the two primary people. And so that's a third way. And for the Journal of Business Anthropology, I've been active in writing and just led what do you call those special issues, although it's not going to be called a special issue, but it's that kind of thing where I organize people to write papers on what we're calling implementation practice. There's so much that's written about research and what anthropologists did for an organization, but what about the actual implementation of the recommendations that came out of the research? How does that process work from an anthropologist's point of view? One of my favorite cases is when I was working on a product team at GM. A product team consists of designers, engineers, business people, who are all working together to produce a vehicle. And to produce a vehicle takes usually around, it varies, it depends on when you start the clock, but somewhere around 4 years, I'd say. And if you get in on the ground floor, as I was able to do with this global product that they wanted to make, it can be extremely revealing. So this particular product program was called the Delta Small Car Program, and I've written about it in a 2004 issue of Long Range Planning. That's an English journal. And I've written about it elsewhere too, but the issue was that GM wanted a car that they could sell in multiple markets. From a business perspective, it's really difficult to do that for many reasons. The road conditions can be very different. Not just the narrowness of the road, but the quality of the road might require a different kind of suspension system, for example. If it's a narrow road, it might require a very tight turning radius on your steering column. There are different insurance requirements around the world. There are different product requirements. For example, crash testing can have different standards in different places. Oftentimes in Europe, at least while we were working on this program, which was between 1996 and 1998, so 2 full years on this, we found that the European requirements were often much stricter than the US requirements, which would drive the American engineers absolutely crazy, and they didn't see why they would have to pay the extra cost to produce their vehicle that would be sold in the U.S. at the same level of standards that for a vehicle that would be sold, say, in Europe. So at any rate, when I got in on this, the first time I talked to one of the people, I was with this German guy, because one of the 3 partners on the product program was Adam Opel, which at the time was German's European manufacturer. And this guy said to me, "Oh, Elizabeth, you should have been with us today at the meeting. It was a classic." And when he said that, he slammed his fist down on the table. And what this suggested, usually when you hear highly specialized terms and phrases like classic, you know there's something going on. And as he told me more, it was clear that he was so frustrated about how this product program had been initiated. It was the second time that Delta had been started. The first time it had totally failed. And this time it looked like it was not getting off on the right foot. So I began talking with the guys who were working for Opel, as well as the 2 American partners, one of which was Saturn, and the other was kind of a hybrid combination of Pontiac and Chevrolet. And what I discovered very quickly within the first couple of months was that their meeting styles were so different that was one of the things that was making them very frustrated. For example, Chevy and Pontiac would use meetings as a way to just discuss the work, and their days would be blocked out in terms of meetings. By contrast, Saturn and Opel did not use meetings just to talk about and debate the issues, but instead they used the meetings to either gain consensus or to make a decision. And so very different ways of thinking about meetings and meeting style and the amount of time you spent in a meeting. But the real kicker was when I found out that their ways of making decisions varied tremendously. So at Chevy and Pontiac, I labeled their form of decision making majority preferred. It was a bit of majority rule, in other words, 51-49, we win, you lose, except that the leader of the program, in this case, the chief engineer on the technical side, or the vehicle line executive on the who ran the overall program, one of those leaders could intervene in a decision and change it, even though it was against the majority. But most of the time, they went along with the majority. So majority preferred was this first form of decision making. Then I noticed that at Saturn, it had nothing to do with majority rule or majority preferred. It was all about reaching consensus. So in other words, if everyone around the table didn't agree with a particular decision, then you didn't have the decision. So then you might ask, well, how on earth did they ever end up making decisions? Well, they had this kind of a rubric. If you were 70% comfortable with a particular decision, you had to agree that you would support it. And that made a lot of sense to people. So in other words, there were compromises that would be made, but, if you were pretty much okay with the decision, you should just go along with it. And then I went to So now you've got majority preferred, and then you've got 100% consensus. And then I went and talked with the Opal people, and those guys said, well, it's not about majority preferred, and it's not about 100% consensus. It's about what the leader wants. So it was really a leadership-driven decision-making model. Now, of course, that leadership model was based on a full understanding, technically, of what the proper course of action should be. So the leader wasn't just shooting from the hip, but rather actually intimately connected with the technical work. But nevertheless, you had these three different decision-making models operating on this product program. How do you think you're going to make a decision together? You know, there was no common framework. So what first I explained to them what I believed was going on, and I remember this day to this point. The chief engineer over the whole program was sitting at the back of the conference table, and he had been sitting forward, and all of a sudden he just fell back into his chair, and he said, "Oh my God, now I understand what's going on." So raising awareness is the first step, but it's not the last step. Then you have to get people to think about, all right, well, what are we going to do here? You know, what is a good solution to getting everyone thinking about making decisions in a common way? And unfortunately, we never were able to get to that point. I conducted some workshops for the three chief engineers, because there was one for each of the three groups, the three partners. And, you know, they certainly understood it, but in a certain sense, their hands were tied. The Adam Opal people, for example, whenever they needed to make big decisions, they had to go back to Germany and get approval from people higher up in the hierarchy than they. And this would drive the Americans crazy, the two groups of Americans, because they said, well, for goodness sakes, you're the chief engineer. Why can't you make the decision? Well, that's really not how we are set up at Opal. So it turned out that these cultural decisions were a key factor in the program's failure. And when the program failed, about 2 years later, it cost GM, in terms of lost volume of vehicles, 2.2 million compact cars. So the stakes are pretty high oftentimes when you're working in the private sector, and maybe, you know, in the public or nonprofit sectors as well. But here clearly was a situation where culture intervened and contributed to the failure of this product program, despite everyone's best intentions and best efforts, including mine. It's often not up to the anthropologist to make the determination about whether or not the organization will implement recommendations that the anthropologist developed, and or developed in conjunction with the people from the particular organization. I think that is something that it's not the failure necessarily of the anthropologist. The anthropologist may be inexperienced or may not do the right thing at the right time, but I think the bottom line is that it really is up to the organization to carry through with the implementation. The anthropologist can be there as a guide, as a coach, as a source of expertise, as a subject matter expert on best ways to get something implemented given the culture of that particular organization. But in fact, it is the implementation belongs to the organization, not to the anthropologist. So while we'd all like to say, gosh, every single one of my projects resulted in a success. In other words, the companies or the nonprofits did what we suggested. That is very unlikely to happen. Sometimes anthropologists are called in to make a point that somebody in the organization has figured out they need some data to advance whatever case they're trying to make to their senior management. That happened in one particular hospital that I worked at. And it was this one hospital was part of a broader hospital system. Nothing ever went anywhere with, as far as I know, with the recommendations that we made in the workshop that we did for them following the presentation that we delivered. But it was out of the hands of the sponsor of the project, who was, one kind of mid-tier leader in this massive hospital system. So I think that what the anthropologist can do is to increase the likelihood that something will get implemented at the end of the period of time that the researcher is with them, is to make sure that there's a way to get to communicate with the most senior people. And that's not always possible. You might have that opportunity or you might not. And even if you do have that opportunity, there's always a chance that the organization is still not willing to make the changes that you and other members of the organization believe should be made. I have a problem in general with the amount of verbiage and discussion that goes on within the anthropological community on ethics. That's not to say that ethics isn't important. I believe ethics are very important, and I believe it's extremely helpful to have guidelines and to kind of know what you should do or what you might consider doing under certain circumstances. Guidelines and discussions with colleagues at that moment. There's a number of ways that you might proceed. But I also think that the amount of attention that anthropologists give to ethics is overblown. I wrote a paper with Tracy Meerwarth that first came out in the Journal of Business Anthropology and now has been updated in a book chapter in a book that just came out this year by Tim Malafite and Bob Moraes. And in that, we argued that there were huge problems with the AAA ethics statement because it emphasized the importance of adhering to these principles that they set forth without regard to any other sets of principles. So, for example, if you work for an organization, there was no recognition, or there is no recognition in the current AAA ethics statement that there's value in having to turn to multiple ethical guidelines in the course of trying to figure out what to do in an ethical situation. And so in our case, we walked the reader through 4 different cases where we had to kind of bounce back and forth between the GM code of ethics and the AAA ethics statement. And we were able to show, I think, that you have to consider both. And then you also have your own personal ethics. What would you do under certain circumstances? And does this sound like it's the appropriate action to take? So that was one big problem we had with it. And another problem that we outlined is that there was this excessive emphasis on research in the AAA ethics statement. Well, it turns out that a lot of practitioners don't do research. I happen to be one of the ones who do, but there are many others who don't. They're project managers, they're analysts, they're intercultural trainers, they're administrators. I mean, they do things that don't necessarily involve research, and so there's no recognition that those kinds of people actually fit under the AAA ethics statement. And then the third big problem with it is that there's this extraordinary amount of emphasis on doing no harm, but nowhere in that ethics statement does it talk about the value of helping organizations or communities change the way they would like to change. So and from that point, there is no emphasis on trying to do some good. I encouraged NAPA to revisit its code of ethics once Tracy and I finished writing this paper, and they took it up. So Neil Tashima has been leading this effort for the last, I'd say, probably 2 years, and we are very close to finalizing the code of ethics, and it's short, 3 pages, and it has some key guidelines such as acknowledge biases, consistently consider the implications of our work, ensure transparency, etc. And I think that it is a much more progressive and informed statement on ethics because it is much more wide-ranging in who falls under the NAPA statement. In other words, both academics and practitioners fall under it, not just academics or not just people who do research. So it's much more inclusive in that respect. And it also recognizes that there are different organizations out there that you have to pay attention to. So if you're doing federally funded work, you have to pay attention to the rules that the government has, the federal government has, for who controls the data, who has the right to publish, all this kind of stuff. So of the work that I have gotten as a consultant with my own business has come from people that I have known. And that just dumbfounded me. That was something that I should have expected but didn't expect. I think partly it's me being an American and you're so focused on the work, the task, the project, that you often don't pay attention to, well, how did I get this project anyway? Or, who called me? Or, and it turns out that only a few of the projects that I've worked on since 2009 came to me cold by people contacting me that I did not know, or I didn't know. I may have known someone that knew them, but it was definitely a very weak tie. And in most cases, in these 2 cases, people contacted me without even a weak tie. And most of the work I've gotten has come from people that I had a very solid tie to. And then in a few cases, the weak tie worked reasonably well. So I say this because I think it matters enormously that people really cultivate their own personal networks, or I should say personal/professional networks, and maintain those so that it increases the likelihood if those people decide to go into consulting that they could potentially result in real project work.